password sharing is me saying, yeah, I'm going to, loan this book I bought out to you. So here's the password, and then you can read the book or listen to the song or whatever.
No, you're looking at it from the wrong perspective. What you do is you own a right to access, but you don't own the thing you're accessing.
If they crack down too hard, where people can't share passwords with even one other person, what's going to happen is Netflix subscriptions will drop and piracy will rise. And I think that is the appropriate response.
I completely disagree with you in the sense that that's an appropriate response. That might be the inevitable response, but that's not appropriate.
So the question here is accessing content and paying for content. And so is password sharing piracy? Hello, this is the Pop Culture Contrarian with Thomas, Sterling, and Andrew. Today we're going to be discussing, is password sharing piracy? And I know that Thomas and Sterling have some differing opinions about this, and they're going to hopefully go at it, and maybe there will be blood, maybe there will not be. I will attempt to moderate from my safe corner over on this side of the screen. Don't get between them.
I see you fully recovered from being dead last week.
I did. Yes.
That's
yes.
Good. That's good.
Yeah, I appreciate your concern.
Mm-hmm.
The sick vacation.
The sick vacation.
Sickcation?
Yeah. For those who are planning to take a vacation in the near future, I recommend not getting sick.
That seems like good advice.
Generally good advice, yeah. All right, you two. Well, let's take it away. Asking the question again, is password sharing piracy?
Well, before we tackle that, let's go back to the beginning of piracy, at least to the beginning of online piracy. So I'm going to reference my own childhood because that's what I know. So in my childhood, originally it was if you wanted to have like a mixtape or a mix CD, you had to burn it yourself, right? So you had the CD you'd bought at the store, and then you copied it onto your computer, and then you copied it onto a CD or a tape. I don't know how they did tapes. I'm too young for that. So there was actually physical work involved, and it was actually fairly simple to do because at that point, CDs didn't have all this DRM stuff, which is all this software that basically keeps you from owning the stuff you buy. So I that was what I experienced. So I kind of always had this idea of being able to manipulate files, and you should be able to do that just because that's what the norm was. Since then, a lot has changed, and there's more complicated methods of piracy now. You've got, the Pirate Bay and BitTorrent. Do y'all know what torrenting is?
I'm
Yes, but why don't you explain it?
Okay.
Yeah, for the listeners, let's tell them what torrenting is.
So torrenting is where you have this, let's say, Avengers, and you want to watch the movie Avengers, but you don't have it. Someone else online does have it. What they do now is they share it on something called BitTorrent or uTorrent, where they only share a tiny little piece of it, but 100 other people also have the same thing. So all of them share a tiny little piece of the movie you want, and you download it from 100 different people's computers, and then your computer assembles it all back together using that software. So that's the method of piracy these days, and I don't know anything about it. I've never done it. I'm totally a law-abiding citizen.
Yes, we believe you.
So you'd admit it is against the law.
Yes, I admit that it's against the law.
Okay.
That's not in contention here.
Okay, good. That helps.
All right. So that's my history with what piracy is, how it works. I've had friends who've literally had every movie on the planet, it seems, downloaded onto a server they had. So I know a little bit about this stuff. Thomas, I think you researched for this a little bit about Napster, which is kind of the real origin of all this stuff. You want to take us through that?
Kind of the origin of online piracy, at least when it came to music, was Napster, which began in 1999.
Okay.
It was Sean Fanning and Sean Parker, two guys got together. I think Fanning had the idea for it, and I think Parker came along to help him build the code for it.
Okay.
But the idea was file sharing, and the file sharing specifically were MP3s, which were songs, music. So he built the company, and it grew like mad within that first year, and people were sharing millions of songs.
And at that time, it was legal, right?
It was legal initially, right? And then the music industry and artists, one in particular that I know because I was a big fan, or do like him still, was Metallica, was objecting to this. And so then
That's not very metal of them.
The courts got involved. well, metal don't like people taking advantage of them. And so it went to the courts, and eventually the ruling came down in 2001. I think it was summer of 2001 on the side of the music industry and the artists.
A dark day for free loving people everywhere.
Free or slave loving people, however you want to look at that. At that point, Napster was effectively dead. It was ordered shut down. I think its assets were bought out by some other companies, and does still exist today as a music sharing company. But
they were bought by Best Buy.
Okay, yeah. And so
lucrative.
It's kind of like now it's kind of like I guess it would be like iTunes or Spotify or something. You can buy a subscription and listen to music.
Yeah, I do know Sean Parker is on the board of Spotify now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so it was kind of a precursor and a pioneer in an age where the idea of the internet was free and open
and
data and information.
These decisions on what constituted, what came to be called piracy and what hadn't been made yet.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and well, you're also dealing with intellectual property rights. Like, what are the parameters for that in a digital age where you can literally share it around the world in splits a second?
Right.
So from those court decisions, we had a all new way of viewing all kinds of stuff, from music to movies, and particularly Netflix. Mm-hmm. And that's really kind of one of the focuses of today's talk.
Yeah.
And so the concept of subscription services and the ability to monetize these mass sharing platforms so that intellectual property is maintained and people still have access easily through the web.
Well, it was the kind of following the court decision against Napster. It was Steve Jobs kind of coming in with the whole iTunes model,
right?
Is really why we have, you could argue, the streaming services that we experience today. In that, here it was
a stepping stone.
It was a stepping stone where people could go and buy. For 99 cents, you could buy whatever song you wanted effectively.
Right. And that was a big change.
That was
before
huge.
You had to buy the whole $10 CD. Or
right, the whole
sure.
album.
And so it was opening the demand. Really, that's a market demand of we don't want to necessarily buy the whole thing. We might just want a hit single, and we want to be able to buy that. But that's still buying each piece,
right?
Every single one. And so from there, so it was a stepping stone, but moving from that into the subscription idea in movies, Netflix kind of a major pioneer. If I recall, I think Spotify, maybe it was Pandora, one of those kind of started you can pay a monthly subscription and access the whole library of music.
Right. Okay.
Well, Pandora started out free, actually. So if you don't know, Pandora is a online radio that you can set up a subscription to and then build your own radio station based on the music you like. But it'll still be randomized. Yeah. So I guess that's how they're able to get away with this, because they can play the songs that people are paying them to play.
Or you can do it, or you can get access it free, but then there's ads.
Ad revenue.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, I still listen to Pandora today.
I can't remember if there were ads on Pandora in the beginning or not.
Yeah, they're always.
Okay.
Maybe not right at the beginning.
Yeah,
maybe not right at the beginning, but
remember
it was pretty
using
quick.
It without ads, I thought. So yeah.
The ads came pretty quick.
So with this new access to practically everything, and with a subscription or ads, the whole idea of password sharing kind of came into play. And the question here is
the workaround.
Well, yeah. So the question here is accessing content and paying for content. And so is password sharing piracy? Sterling, do you want to share your opinion first?
Password sharing, in my mind, is I have something that I have bought online, either the rights to or physically, or actually bought the item itself. Password sharing is me saying, I'm going to, loan this book I bought out to you. So here's the password, and then you can read the book or listen to the song or whatever. So, or, watch the movie. So in that sense, to me, password sharing is just the exact same as loaning out a physical object. And you should absolutely be allowed to do it. That's briefly my position.
And to that point, just to outline Netflix's position on this over time, there was not too long ago a February campaign for Valentine's Day. It was one maybe 2 years ago, probably 2 years ago, where they said password sharing is love, or sharing your password is love, essentially. And that sounds like encouraging people to share their password to me from the very organization that is the gold standard in the industry.
Right. In terms of digital streaming, Netflix is the gold standard. Yeah.
Yes. But then, of course, most people will be aware. And for those who aren't, I'm telling you now, they're cracking down on that internationally and starting to here in America. I think they already did.
Yeah, they did, at least for me. Currently, the people who used to use the Netflix account I had when I had it active was myself and my parents. And my parents weren't allowed to log in anymore because they were in a different house.
Yeah.
So I canceled my account.
Yeah, so they track where the IP address is pulling from. And if you don't pay them extra to have an add-on, then you're going to be banned, basically.
Right.
Thomas, what's your position on the password sharing?
Well, I guess to back up to what Sterling was saying, he said if I bought a book and I wanted to loan out my book, I'm free to loan out my book to someone else. I completely agree with that. The difference is you're not just loaning out your one access point to what you've purchased the rights to. You could, with password sharing, loan it out to literally hundreds of people. So at one point, does what your one that you've gained access to, that you purchased, now allows you to open it up to potentially hundreds, maybe even thousands, if on the extreme example. That's where I feel like the problem lies, and that's what they're addressing. I don't think that really in the description you do of like borrowing a book or something, that's not what Netflix is objecting to. I think what Netflix is objecting to is like, where is that rights to the purchase of the product that we're allowing you to is intended for you. And so if you're going to go and share that out there, you're effectively, what you're doing is it's like taking that one book and then going to a printer and making hundreds of copies of the one book and then going and just giving them all away or giving them all to your friends. They're losing all that revenue potentially from that. They wouldn't object to you letting someone else borrow your book, but they would object to someone else, to you taking and making multiple copies of it and then distributing it to all these friends. So I think that's a distinct difference in that example that I would point out. And I think that's what they're trying to combat.
Just to push back a little bit against that, I've known many people who've password shared for years. And one, let's acknowledge that Netflix is changing the rules here.
Yeah.
And they've updated their terms many, many times. And it's like, okay, right. I agree to this because I want to watch the show you're keeping me from watching. So I'm going to agree to this. It doesn't actually mean I agree to it. It means I'm clicking the button I have to click to so I can watch my movie. But so they first said, yeah, you're allowed to password share and encouraged it. And they did actually encourage it. And then in March 2022, they swapped and said, no, we're not encouraging this anymore. We're going to crack down on it. But what you said about hundreds of people, I've known many people who've password shared. Mostly they were roommates. And then when they moved out and got different roommates, they got a new password and a new account. I've never heard of people sharing it with even dozens of people, the same account. Okay,
so do you think that it's really about just another person, that they're worried that you're sharing it with one or two other people?
From experience, they're worried about me sharing it with two other people.
I would gather that this is a much bigger problem for them than just someone sharing it with two or three other people.
Well, I guess more hesitant than you to give Netflix, the multi-billion-dollar company, the benefit of the doubt.
No, I mean, the size of the company, it doesn't matter in that I don't take into the fact that they're wealthy. Who cares? That's not the issue if the principle is the same. And I think in this instance, where your anecdotal experience aside, when you look at the broader scope of what this company is doing, and it's a big company and it's worldwide, it's not just merely the United States. Mm-hmm. And the United States has long held, in a lot of ways, is the gold standard for protecting intellectual property. Our laws and everything like that have been constantly progressing in this sense because we recognize that intellectual property matters. Mm-hmm. Other countries don't have that don't have anywhere close to that kind of concern over intellectual property.
Right.
Shout out to China.
Yes.
And so I think probably the majority of this problem for Netflix is not necessarily coming from the United States. I do think there are issues in the United States, but it's probably bigger in other countries where they just don't have the culture of concern over property rights in the same sense.
I do know that in the past they were only cracking down overseas, and now they're cracking down in the U.S. too. So if it's other countries that don't respect property rights and you want to crack down there and you have the capability to crack down there, I'm not there. I don't care.
Well, maybe.
But
what would be a compromise for you if they said you're allowed to share with 2 people, or 3 people? Would you be fine with that then?
I would be willing to pay for my account again if I was allowed to share with 3 people, no questions asked.
Okay, well that would be, I would think, a way in which they could kind of find the middle ground in this from going, like you say, because I do think that's a legitimate criticism of them saying last year or whenever it was, hey, share your password because that's love, and then now, no, it's illegal.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
I mean, so yeah, there's a compromised position would be better.
Yeah.
So
let's let Andrew take the nuanced position, though, Thomas. You need to be fiery and angry and tell me I'm a thief, right?
No, I mean, I do think the theft is the key principal issue here. That's with anything, any type of intellectual property rights. The concern, just like personal property rights, personal property. If someone came and took it and they never paid for it, that's theft.
Right. And I acknowledge the stark clarity that is provided by having a physical object. If I have an apple and you take my apple, you have stolen from me, and that is wrong. Same if I do it to you.
Yeah, but
because it's a physical
you could
object.
grow another apple.
Sure. I know you don't mean that, so I'm not going to address it. But I think when there's a physical object involved, it becomes very clear. I think when it's something as oblique, abstract as a account to access a streaming service, or even a song that has been put onto a file that is now on your computer, or especially I think this applies to like ebooks, then it's much more murky. Because especially with an ebook, for what reason does an ebook need to cost $14.99 the same as a paperback copy?
Well, then again,
that depends on the market.
It depends on the market. What are people willing to pay for it? And maybe, to your point, maybe the reason it costs $14.99 is because people are stealing the intellectual property rights and copying it illegally and then sharing it.
Or maybe it's because they don't have a better alternative, and so they're like, "Well, I need the book, so I guess I'll pay $15."
No. Come on, scarcity isn't a position to argue for theft. I'm sorry, I don't agree with that.
Well, that is actually my argument on this, and I push back on it being theft. Mm-hmm. So, going into my history of piracy. So here's when not I, of course, some hypothetical person named Stuart. When Stuart was younger, Stuart was watching the TV show Game of Thrones, and he desperately wanted to watch the current season as it was coming out. So he went to the HBO website, and he tried to sign up for an account, and it said, "Give us your cable connection, information, so we can hook you up with your online account based on your actual physical cable account." Well, Stuart didn't have a TV. He also didn't have cable. He had no interest in having cable. But HBO at that time was not providing a method for someone without cable to access this content. So Stuart resorted to BitTorrenting. He did break the law, yes. Whether he broke any moral law is a question. So when literally the option was not available, unless he was willing to spend, $70 a month on cable, I think at that point it's both reasonable and not immoral to pirate it.
I completely disagree. I think that what is the limit to that principle? I mean, where is the rationale that says if I want something, you didn't need it. You didn't need to be.
Stuart didn't need it.
Stuart.
Stewie.
Stuart did not need to see Game of Thrones. He wanted to, but he didn't.
And Stuart was willing to pay. He just wasn't willing to pay for cable and then also pay for the online subscription.
So
if they had a method where he could just pay for the online subscription, he would have.
Right, and it's good that you would have, but would have. But the problem of not being able to access because of certain boundaries or parameters. You said he could have gone and bought an entire cable subscription if he was that desperate. Correct?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. So there was a potential pathway to satiate his strong desire to see the Game of Thrones.
So
Sounds like we've kind of got two different scenarios we're talking about here.
Yeah.
So initially we've led with the idea of password. Okay, you are paying for something.
Mm-hmm.
And then to what extent do you have the right to share that thing that you have paid for?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think we have there's a difference of opinion, but I think maybe a compromise that if we could share with a certain amount of people, then it would be okay as long as it's not disseminating it to thousands or hundreds.
Sure. If Netflix's problem, going back to that, if Netflix's problem truly is, and I would bet so much money that this is not their problem, but if Netflix's problem truly is that one person is paying for an account and sharing it with dozens or hundreds or thousands of people, then put a limit on that and say you can have 4 IP addresses that can log in. I'm fine with that.
Okay.
I'd totally be fine with that. I'd bet almost anything that that's not their problem and that they don't want me sharing it with those 4 IP addresses.
So that's the one moral/legal scenario that we're dealing with. The second moral/legal scenario that we're dealing with is barrier to access, financial barrier to access, and whether or not it's permissible based on I would access it at this level. I'd be willing to pay this much, but I'm not willing to pay this much.
I think it's an issue of reasonability.
Yeah.
It's not reasonable to expect me to sign up for a whole cable package just to sign up for an online subscription just to watch one show.
Yeah, but how is that HBO's problem?
Well, it was HBO's problem because instead of paying for it, I pirated it.
No.
Stuart did.
That's not HBO's obligation to make sure that you have the system in place to be able to access their stuff. It may behoove them as far as their business to try to make themselves as accessible as possible to earn your dollar, but it isn't their responsibility to ensure that you have access.
It's not their, I guess, responsibility,
No.
but it's not my responsibility to go out and get the access they have arranged. So the way I
would
see
say
it,
if you
this
wanna
is very
see it,
similar
it is.
to if the East India Trading Company was not willing to bring tea to the United States. They just weren't willing at the time of the Revolution to ship it to the United States. They would
Okay.
ship it to Great Britain, but they would not ship it to the United States.
Okay.
So, sure, the colonists in Boston could hire a ship, send it all the way to England, buy the tea there, and then sail it back. Or a smuggler could sail it from England to them and then sell it there. And would it be morally wrong of the colonists to buy from the smuggler? In my opinion, absolutely not.
I think it could be, yeah. If you know where you're getting it, and it's it's kind of like questions of like the black market, purchasing things on the black market. You know that what is you're purchasing has been gotten illegally, and yet you're saying, I don't care, I'm going to get it. I didn't actually steal it, but I'm willing to buy it from
It was
somebody
not
who did
gotten
steal
illegally. It fell off the back of the truck, as we all know.
However you
Stuart found it.
however you
Yes.
try to justify it. I think the principle still remains the same. The question I think maybe we're dancing around here is the nature of, like you were saying, with a physical thing you buy, it's much more concrete, and you can say, I have this and it's kind of mine.
Right.
I
When
think
Stuart pirated that episode, HBO was not devoid of something they had before.
no, you're looking at it from the wrong perspective. What you do is you own a right to access, but you don't own the thing you're accessing, right? And so these streaming services, what you're buying is not actually all the stuff on there. You're buying the right to access the stuff on there. You don't own any of that stuff. And so what gives you the right to share that stuff with other people?
So I think what we're dealing with here may be a difference in generational opinion.
Well, that's certainly, I do think most of my peers would tend more to agree with what I'm saying, and most of your peers would tend more to agree with what you're saying, Thomas.
Yeah, I think too, and we can maybe try and dig into this. We already sort of are, but going back to Napster and what it ignited and the idea of should things on the internet just be free.
Right. Especially, yeah. And that idea was very prevalent in the early days of the internet. Or I'd say early.
Since we're dealing with material versus
Immaterial.
more or less immaterial
Right.
things, ideas or just digital copies of things.
Going back to the ebook example, with a physical paperback, it makes sense to have it cost $15 or however much. You've got first the writing it, and you want the author to make some money, sure. But then you have to actually print it and put a physical copy in a store for you to pick up. With an ebook, the writer has written it and has sold the rights to this company, and then there's no more cost involved except for running the servers. So why on earth should it cost the same amount? Make it cost $3 and have 80% of that go to the author. I'm fine with that.
But the truth is, if you go on Amazon right now and you look at a book, the ebook is always going to be cheaper than the hardback.
It's not. That's not true.
I just did today and bought a hardback, and the ebook was cheaper.
Hardback versus, I said paperback.
And paperback was actually, I think, cheaper or the same price. The idea, though, is I think still you're talking about something that, because it's in digital form, why does that change it from being effectively less valuable?
Well, because there's a cost to printing the paper that isn't there.
Right, but there's a cost
ebook.
to
So it is cheaper, but it's still $10 for a digital copy of this book I'm looking at, and $20 for a paperback.
Well, you know what that is, because of inflation.
Well, certainly.
No, but I mean,
Bidenomics.
I think that there is costs that go into building servers, upkeeping servers, having software engineers that are there to ensure that everything's running fine and all this other stuff. It's not just, hey, it doesn't cost you anything now because it's all digital. No, there's still cost associated with it, and that cost is going to be factored into what the product is that they're selling when it's digital. If it's in digital, just think of the gaming industry. I mean, how much money is tied up in the gaming industry, and so little of it, you could say, is actually in physical form.
Okay.
I mean, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry, right? And yet it's making way more money now than it did when Nintendo cartridges and all this other stuff were being produced.
So kind of pivoting from defending piracy to attacking the current system.
Okay.
With video gaming, that's a good example, because with a lot of video games, even very expensive to make, very expensive to maintain, with online multiplayer where people are always playing, so there's a constant upkeep cost.
Right.
Most, actually, of the really big games of that sort are moving towards free to play.
Okay.
And then they'll have additional content you can buy if you want to,
right.
and or cosmetics that you can buy.
Okay.
And the point of the cosmetics is sold as, this way you can play for free, but then if you want to support us, you buy the cosmetic,
right?
And we can keep doing this. So I actually am all on board with that. If you want to start doing Netflix where there's a cosmetic or something with Netflix where I can pay them just to acknowledge that I want to support them, I'm fine with that. But let me share my freaking password.
Well,
and that's I think the trend that we're seeing in the 21st century is more supporting companies and businesses that we like, especially when it's entertainment, for the purpose of allowing them to keep going versus simply for the purpose of having access to what they've created.
Yeah, well, what you're going to end up with, and I think it's probably unavoidable, but it's going to be more commercials. That's been the manner in which that's how network television for all those years was able to grow and sustain and make programs, is because of commercials. And yeah, you didn't have to. You bought your TV, and if you could get the signals, it was free technically.
Mm-hmm.
So the reason when cable first came into existence and all these cable channels, and it's still true with like HBO today, you don't get commercials because you're paying for the product.
Well, that was the idea when it was first sold. It's not true anymore.
It still is true with many of the streaming services.
Streaming, you said cable. With cable, you do get commercials.
No, you're
cable
right.
Cable was sold as no commercials,
Yeah,
and now you get commercials.
And this is what I'm afraid is going to happen with the streaming service.
Yeah,
because
I
what
think
they're
you're
going
right.
to do is realize, well, we can monetize in order to monetize. And the argument will be, well, it's a cost-saving measure, so you're not paying even more a month for this service.
I think I think you're probably right. It will lead to more commercials. But I think what I hope and what the video game industry could teach Netflix is if you have a dedicated group of people who like your product, you can convince them to support you just for the purpose of being able to continue making that product. And you don't have to do it in the kind of manipulative way with ads and stuff where you're kind of forcing them to support you. You can actually do you want more of this? Give me money so I can keep making more of this. And that's actually incredibly lucrative. That's where you get, like with Twitch and with all sorts of these current streaming things where people pay money just because, hey, I like what you're doing, do more.
Yeah, I mean,
and so if they have the courage,
it would be interesting.
Then we can move to a better system.
Yeah, it would be interesting to compare the two systems, as you say. I'm wondering though, overall dollar value, because what you're basically comparing is pay to access versus free, but please donate.
Right.
Which is how we operate.
Which is how we operate.
Post.
And I mean, we do put a lot of energy into that aspect of it, is to letting people know, hey, I hope you like us, please.
And
support us.
It's a point of principle to never have any ads in our content.
Right. Except for the Patriot Post.
Yeah.
Go read it.
We'll plug it. That's not enough.
Yeah.
So those are two interesting models. I don't know if one is, on a bigger scale, like you're talking about, and the amount of money that is available in to pay to access. What Netflix has done is, it revolutionized kind of streaming by doing original content, which it was the first streaming service to do that.
It revolutionized it several times. First, just by having it, having digital streaming, and then with adding their own original
Interestingly, it put Blockbuster out of business.
Yes. And just for some flavor, Netflix contacted Blockbuster and was like, do you want to buy us, when they were young? And Blockbuster was like, no, that's stupid.
They couldn't see it. Yeah. No, it just, what I guess the bottom line in that scenario is, would a crowdfunded, effectively what you're saying, system provide enough constant or consistent income to be able to have the money to produce the programs that people are wanting? It might. I don't know.
Well, I think if you look at the budgets for these Netflix shows and then the quality, it seems incredibly clear to me that there's a whole lot of, maybe it's overhead, but I think a lot of it's probably just graft and or just pocketing the money that goes along with this, because they spend more than, any blockbuster movie on some of these shows, and then the CGI is still terrible. And it's like, where did all that money go? And so I think there's plenty of room for them to keep making original content without spending $400 million on a single season of a TV show.
Yeah, maybe. It's hard, because when actors become famous and you want the best actors, or when, like, for example, I wonder how much it cost Netflix for their first season of Stranger Things versus what it's going to cost them for their fifth.
That's a good point.
Because once popularity happens, all of a sudden things change quickly.
Right.
Well,
I'm sorry, Andrew. We've been hogging the conversation.
You guys are going at each other's throats as you're supposed to be, and I appreciate both of your opinions. I guess to sum it up, we started with a overview, like what got us here.
Yeah.
The whole Napster movement, the online sharing of digital files for music, and legal action, moving into the iTunes era, buying individual pieces of content, then the subscription services, and then whether or not sharing passwords for access is piracy versus just straight up piracy when the when the service is creating an unreasonable or
barrier to entry. Yeah, but I will say, as the person with friends who are pro piracy,
Stuart.
Just to be clear, the person with every movie in the world downloaded on a server is not me. It's not Stuart. It's a totally third person. Just to be clear, that's not hypothetical. But I do understand, absolutely, if a movie's just coming out in theaters and there's a pirated copy out there and people are pirating it instead of going to the movie, that is wrong. I see that. But if it's a movie that came out in 1989 and the streaming companies just haven't done all the paperwork to get the rights to show that movie and someone just wants to watch it for a movie night, is that really wrong? I would say no.
So I think that I'll say two things. I think companies and content creators would do best to approach this from a perspective of generosity.
Yeah.
I think they're going to do financially better because just a principle of marketing is people buy from people they like.
Yep.
And if you like
That's why we don't buy from Budweiser.
Correct. But if you like what a service is doing and you identify with them, you're going to be willing to pay them for, and maybe you have like a premium content kind of thing.
Right.
I think that it would be wise for companies to put a reasonable barrier. So in the case of the password sharing, say, hey, you can share with this many people. I do side with Thomas, however, on the perspective of if you have access and then you are just disseminating it at infinite.
Yeah, ad infinitum. And I'm there too. If you're sharing your Netflix password with dozens or hundreds of people, stop.
Yeah.
Clearly, that's not what they're letting you have access to
Yeah.
when they give you an account.
But I don't really think that it's a moral issue to share it with a couple of people, because I really do think that you are treating it finitely in that state. If you are treating something finitely in your material dissemination, then that's the same as letting them borrow a book. But if you are treating it infinitely, then that's a moral problem, in my opinion.
On that topic, I will say my friend Stuart has this big digital library of audiobooks he has purchased. So he not physically, but he has handed over money for a copy of the audiobook, and it's his audiobook forever. He doesn't have to keep paying for it. Stuart does not feel any qualms about sharing the password to that audiobook library he has bought, just like he wouldn't feel any qualms about loaning out a book with however many people, because they're not all going to be reading the same book at the same time.
Thomas?
I think, I do think that this is going to be continually an issue that's the courts will continue to work on trying to outline the limits. I do think, to play kind of a little bit of devil advocate against my own side here, I think the question of any business that wants to grow, it needs to have a means of allowing the public effectively access to the product in which, so they get to know what it is. And I think the model that's kind of been developing and increasingly so is what we see with YouTube, where artists and the music industry and effectively what I think has kind of happened is the war with the music industry against pirating is kind of changed. They've started to recognize that we can, by exposure to all these different artists out here, where people can get exposed to them for free, there's going to be a greater potential for monetary benefit from that for them.
I do know that with a lot of these kind of creators, there's a much bigger emphasis on touring now.
Right.
Because that's a one-time experience that you have to buy a ticket for.
But one of the things that is actually, if you were a music artist and you just love touring and doing your songs, it's probably as good a time as it's ever been for you, because the chance of getting exposure online is huge with like YouTube. However, you're not making royalties anymore like they used to with album sales and stuff like that. That's just that's kind of a thing of a past era.
Right.
And so there might be more music artists that are getting their name out there because of the YouTube, but they're not making money off of the sales of their music.
But they, like on Spotify, they do make money for every listen to their songs. So it's possible they're actually getting more money than they would under the old system.
For the top ones, that is true. For a lot more who are just kind of...
There have been a lot of artist complaints about making practically nothing.
Yeah.
A lot of them just don't... I mean, there's a lot of guys... I think the recent Oliver Anthony thing was lightning in a bottle right there, just boom, it happened. That is so rare, even with YouTube, that he exploded this overnight. And the reason we've talked about this, why we think it happened, but that is far from the norm.
Yeah,
most definitely. Well, I think that you're right. The courts will have to continue to decide on this, but I would encourage companies and creators to err on the side of your fans, err on the side of advocate for a system where people don't have barrier and frustration to your products, where they feel good and happy about paying for your products.
Right. And that's just to finish up my point from earlier. With Netflix doing the no password sharing, I think that is the inevitable result, and I think it's what they deserve. If they crack down too hard, where people can't share passwords with even one other person, what's going to happen is Netflix subscriptions will drop and piracy will rise, and I think that is the appropriate response. It teaches them, do better, figure out another plan.
I completely disagree with you in the sense that that's an appropriate response. That might be the inevitable response, but that's not appropriate, and morally speaking. I think that if they decide to make that choice and that choice blows up in their face because people say, well, we're not going to pay, that's fine. That people decide to then take it and then pirate it and in response, no, that's the people taking it a step too far by saying, well, I'm just not going to pay. Good, fine. You'll send your message that way. But I don't think the idea of, I think the issue here that gets me is I feel like there's a culture that's developed that's more, maybe it's just because of the internet, but this kind of culture of the internet should be free. We should be able to get everything free. That did not used to exist, I would say, for the most part prior to the internet, except in like communist countries, I guess. I don't know. But I think that if we want it, we should be able to get it free or for almost nothing. Is kind of a problematic attitude, I would say. But.
Well, a lot of this is tied up with the idea of property rights in the other way as well. Because the original idea was, I have this CD, I own the CD, I can do what I want with it. And then digital rights have come in, and what that is it's software on the CD itself that keeps you from doing what you want with your CD, even just for yourself. There's nothing that differentiates between using that file on the CD for yourself and using that file on the CD to spread it out to thousands of people on the internet.
It still, though, is the difference between, I think, a finite object. Because when you take the CD has all the digital coding and stuff on it for the song or whatever. And if you're copying it, you're removing it from that physical copy of what you have. And then, like you're saying, you could literally share it, potentially ad infinitum. It's changed. It's not like you can take, like, you could go buy an axe, right? And you could file that axe down and file pieces off that axe, but you can't make that same axe, multiple copies of it, and just give it to everybody else around you, and it's the same axe. Mm-hmm. So I think there's that element. That's the catch point. Is at what point what are you actually owning? Are you owning, like, the artist who creates the song? Now, if it's a painting, you can get a picture of the painting, you can make copies of it, but you don't actually have the painting,
right?
But music is one of those weird things where, how do you define that? I mean, it's you get a recording, and that recording can be played, and you can now, we can make multiple copies of the recording. That's where I think the challenge for these intellectual property rights has always been kind of this harder area to maybe feel like or define, I think, to some degree. So when you buy a copy of it, you're like, oh, I have the right to this copy. Yes, absolutely. But where is that limit to the rights to that copy? I think that's what the challenge is.
I don't think your point of view is unreasonable.
No, I hope not.
I admit that I am firmly on the side of stuff on the internet should be free. That is my attitude, because there's little to no cost to it existing on the internet. So I think it should be free. But you've made good arguments for your point of view, I think. And I will just say this one's not hypothetical. This is real. I have
This wasn't
No. Stuart. All that Stuart stuff. Stuart's a real person. He did all the stuff I told about him doing, not me. It was Stuart. But this is really me.
Is Stuart a mouse?
I'm not answering any further questions about Stewart.
We all hope so.
No comment. Anyhow, I have access to what probably among people I know, the only digital copy of the original Star Wars trilogy without all the edits that were made. Because first George Lucas and then now Disney absolutely refuse to make that available in any form. The last time it was truly available was the special edition DVDs in like 2007. On one of the bonus discs, they had a little tiny, barely visible copy of the original theatrical run. But before that, the last time it was out was in VHS, and I have a copy of that VHS digitally. If I wanted to share it with someone, I think I should be legally allowed to. I'm not, but I think legally that I should be, because there is no other way to access that content at all anymore, and there's no way to pay for it either.
Yeah, well, you didn't make it, so the law would come after you.
I made the digital copy.
No, well, yeah. I'm just saying.
Well, I think we're going to continue to fight about this going forward.
Well, what's our conclusion here? Are we going to?
I don't think we have a conclusion.
Well, let's just answer yes or no.
Yes or
Is
no,
password sharing piracy? For me, no, that's absolutely, it's a different thing than piracy. I also don't think piracy is necessarily wrong, though.
Arr.
Yo ho ho.
I also don't think it's piracy with limits. But I think there is a distinct limit where if you are disseminating it broadly, then it is.
Yeah, I agree with that.
But I do think it is also different than some of the other contextually relevant scenarios we've talked about and mediums we've talked about, which those cases I think are piracy.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if I'm gonna err on one side or another, I'm gonna err on it calling it piracy. But I do think that there can be a more of a compromised position, which is like a more delineated kind of explanation of you have the rights, and this is what your rights include when you bought this this access, and it can mean like you can share it with 4 people or something like that. Mm-hmm. I think that should be a compromise that is out there, but I don't know what Netflix is.
Netflix ought to stick to their guns and not be ambiguous.
Well, they brought it on themselves with
this. Which guns are they sticking to? They've had different guns.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I agree with you guys in that inconsistency is why they've invited this once they change their position.
And just on that, Netflix is actually one of the primary reasons piracy fell dramatically in the early 2010s was because suddenly there was actually a reasonably attainable way to access this content without having to do it via piracy. And so once that happened, piracy fell dramatically.
So reasonable access equals reduction in piracy.
Right.
Boom.
Or you could say reasonable, or you could say more low cost access. Because I think
low barrier access. Yeah.
Yeah, that would be the best way to put it.
I guess the cost would be the highest barrier, the biggest barrier potentially. I think it is interesting that because I know we're kind of extending this conversation a little bit, but all the streaming services are now upping the cost for their streaming
relentlessly, over and over again.
And I think that that's where, unless somebody comes in, one streaming service comes in that's got a lot of access to this stuff and says, you know what, we're going to go against the grain and we're going to keep our costs low, and everybody's going to dump into them. Mm-hmm. But it seems like right now everybody's at the same time raising everything, which is frustrating. Yeah. It's kind of what happened with cable.
It's exactly what happened with cable, and a lot of people saw this coming as soon as Hulu launched. When it was just Netflix, the idea was, we might have this perfect online method to watch every movie ever made, and you just have to pay one place. And then Hulu launched, and if you were paying attention, you were like, oh boy, we're going to get cable via the internet now.
Well, that's probably the direction we're going.
Well, because cable's dying.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well,
on that happy note,
cable is dying. Streaming services are turning into cable. Meanwhile, this has been the Pop Culture Contrarian podcast. We've been asking the question, is password sharing piracy? Feel free to leave us a comment and let us know your opinion. The Patriot Post is our sponsoring organization for the PopCon or Pop Culture Contrarian. Patriot Post is the oldest online conservative news opinion digest. Go to patriotpost.us, like and subscribe. Thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye.